She invited her lover over while her husband was away on a work trip, completely unaware that his wife would be the one to walk in and expose everything. Melissa had always been careful about the way she managed her secrets, convincing herself that control was the same thing as safety. When her husband, Aaron, left town for a week-long work trip, she treated it not as an absence, but as an opportunity, one she believed she had earned after years of feeling unseen and underappreciated. To the outside world, her marriage looked stable enough, built on routine, shared responsibilities, and a quiet understanding that had replaced excitement long ago. Inside, however, Melissa felt restless, increasingly drawn to the attention of someone who made her feel chosen in a way she no longer felt at home. That someone was Daniel, a man whose own marriage existed mostly on paper, held together by habit rather than intention. Their connection had started cautiously, framed as harmless conversations that slowly crossed lines neither of them acknowledged out loud. By the time Aaron's trip was scheduled, Melissa had already decided that bringing Daniel into her home felt less risky than meeting elsewhere. She told herself it was logical, discreet, and temporary, another way of maintaining control over a situation she believed she understood completely. The house felt different that evening, quieter, but charged with anticipation she had not felt in years. Melissa moved through familiar rooms with a sense of confidence, reassured by the certainty that no one was supposed to interrupt her carefully planned evening. She had considered the risks, or at least the ones she thought mattered, and dismissed them with practiced ease. What she did not consider was the existence of variables beyond her own perspective, people whose lives intersected with hers in ways she could not predict. Daniel arrived exactly when expected, carrying the same composure he always did, the kind that reassured Melissa she was not making a reckless decision. She told herself this was contained, that it would end before it complicated anything beyond repair. In her mind, boundaries still existed, even if she had stepped over them. What Melissa failed to recognize was how fragile those imagined boundaries truly were. While she focused on the absence of her husband, she ignored the presence of another woman whose life was quietly unraveling elsewhere. Daniel's wife, Claire, had not planned to appear in Melissa's world that night, but suspicion had been building for months, fueled by subtle changes she could no longer dismiss. When she finally decided to follow instinct rather than reassurance, she set in motion a collision Melissa never anticipated. Inside the house, time moved forward as Melissa expected, unaware that elsewhere, the narrative was shifting rapidly. She believed secrecy was protecting her, that careful timing and familiar surroundings insulated her from consequence. Yet the same confidence that allowed her to invite another man into her home also blinded her to the fact that secrecy rarely belongs to one person alone. Every choice creates ripples, and Melissa had underestimated how far hers would travel. By the time the evening settled into what she assumed was safety, the reality forming just beyond her awareness was already closing in. She did not know it yet, but the story she believed she was controlling was about to be taken out of her hands entirely, rewritten not by her husband, but by the one person she never thought would cross her threshold. Melissa's confidence remained intact through the early hours of the evening, reinforced by the silence of her phone and the predictable stillness of the neighborhood. She moved with ease, convinced that careful planning had eliminated uncertainty, and that the temporary nature of her choices insulated her from lasting consequence. Daniel's presence felt familiar now, almost routine, and that familiarity fed the illusion that nothing truly dangerous was happening. She told herself that secrecy did not equal betrayal if it was managed responsibly, that this was a contained deviation rather than a fracture. Outside her carefully curated bubble, however, the balance had already shifted. Claire's doubts had matured into certainty long before that night, shaped by missed calls, altered schedules, and the subtle distance that grows when someone invests their attention elsewhere. When reassurance stopped working, instinct took over, guiding her toward answers she no longer trusted her husband to provide. The decision to follow him was not impulsive. It was the result of months spent questioning her own perceptions. As Melissa continued her evening, believing control was on her side, Claire was moving steadily toward a confrontation Melissa never imagined. Inside the house, Melissa remained focused on the present moment, dismissing fleeting thoughts of guilt as unnecessary complications. She rationalized her behavior by comparing it to the emotional neglect she felt in her marriage, framing her actions as a response rather than a choice. The comfort of familiar surroundings reinforced that narrative, making everything feel safer than it was. She believed consequences belonged to distant scenarios, not to a quiet night unfolding exactly as planned. What she did not realize was how quickly certainty can collapse once another perspective enters the frame. Claire arrived without hesitation, guided by information she had pieced together carefully, each detail confirming what denial once obscured. She approached the house not with anger, but with clarity, prepared to see whatever truth waited behind the door. Melissa remained unaware of the shift occurring outside, still operating under the assumption that absence guaranteed freedom. The security she felt was built on a single flawed premise, that she was the only one capable of acting decisively. That belief shattered the moment Claire crossed the threshold, bringing with her the reality Melissa had refused to consider. The atmosphere inside the house changed instantly, not through raised voices or dramatic gestures, but through the undeniable weight of exposure. Melissa's carefully constructed sense of control dissolved as the situation moved beyond her influence, revealing the fragility of the boundaries she imagined she maintained. The truth no longer belonged to her alone, and the narrative she believed she directed now unfolded under someone else's gaze. In that moment, Melissa understood too late that secrecy does not protect those who rely on it, and that the absence of her husband had never guaranteed safety. What she had dismissed as manageable had instead become unavoidable, and the night she believed was hers to control was already slipping beyond recovery. The moment Claire entered the house, the illusion Melissa had built over months collapsed into something unmistakably real, and no amount of mental reframing could soften what followed. Melissa did not need words to understand the shift. It was visible in the stillness that settled into the room, the kind that arrives when truth no longer needs explanation. Claire's presence carried a weight that instantly reframed everything Melissa had justified to herself. This was no longer a private choice, hidden behind careful timing and selective honesty. It was exposure, not dramatic or explosive, but precise and final. Melissa became acutely aware of how fragile her sense of control had always been, how dependent it was on other people remaining unaware or passive. She had believed secrecy was an individual skill, something she could manage alone. Yet she now saw that secrecy exists only until someone else decides to look closely enough. Claire did not appear shocked in the way Melissa expected. Instead, she looked resolved, as though the confirmation brought relief rather than devastation. That realization unsettled Melissa more than anger ever could have. It meant this moment had been anticipated, prepared for, emotionally processed long before it happened. The situation was no longer about catching someone off guard, but about witnessing the consequences of patterns that had already revealed themselves. Melissa felt an unfamiliar vulnerability rise within her, not rooted in fear of her husband's reaction, but in the awareness that her actions were now anchored in someone else's reality. The narrative she had rehearsed privately dissolved, replaced by the understanding that justification loses meaning once it leaves the mind of the person using it. Claire did not need explanations to recognize betrayal. The context was self-evident. Melissa sensed that whatever sympathy she once hoped for no longer existed, replaced by clarity shaped by months of doubt. As the situation unfolded, Melissa became increasingly aware of how small her rationalization sounded in the presence of someone who had been systematically excluded from the truth. She had told herself this affair existed in a separate compartment of her life, isolated from the rest, but the overlap now felt unavoidable. Daniel's role in the scene faded into the background as Melissa recognized that the true reckoning was not about him at all. It was about the moment when private choice intersected with shared consequence. Claire's attention focused less on the betrayal itself and more on its location, the violation of space that transformed a personal failure into a broader breach of trust. The house, once Melissa's refuge, now felt exposed, stripped of its imagined neutrality. She understood that bringing the affair into her home had intensified the harm in ways she had never fully considered. It was no longer about secrecy in public or discretion in distance. It was about the deliberate erosion of boundaries meant to protect shared life. As Claire remained present, observing rather than reacting, Melissa felt a quiet unraveling take place within herself. The excitement she once associated with secrecy drained away, replaced by a stark awareness of permanence. This moment could not be undone or reframed. It would exist in memory not as a mistake, but as a defining point of fracture. Melissa realized that no version of future honesty could erase the fact that someone else had been forced to discover the truth rather than offered it willingly. The situation moved beyond embarrassment or guilt into something more destabilizing, the recognition that her choices had reshaped multiple lives simultaneously. Claire's departure from the house carried an unspoken finality, leaving behind a silence heavier than any confrontation. Melissa remained in place long after, processing the shift from control to consequence. She felt the weight of inevitability settle in, understanding that what came next would no longer be influenced by her intentions or explanations. The affair had crossed the threshold from hidden indulgence to exposed reality, and the ripple effects were only beginning. Melissa sensed that the quiet collapse she experienced internally was merely the opening phase of a much larger reckoning, one that would soon extend beyond this house, beyond this night, and into every corner of the life she believed she had managed so carefully until now. The hours that followed Claire's departure unfolded with an unsettling slowness, as though time itself had lost its usual rhythm. Melissa remained in the house, moving from room to room without purpose, noticing details she had long taken for granted now stripped of comfort. Every object felt implicated, every familiar surface suddenly foreign. The confidence that once fueled her decisions had evaporated, replaced by a quiet understanding that the structure of her life had already begun to fracture beyond repair. Daniel left shortly after, his departure marked not by urgency, but by the subtle detachment of someone who sensed the consequences would not be his to carry in full. Melissa did not follow him or attempt to salvage anything from the evening. Her focus had shifted inward, consumed by the realization that exposure had transformed choice into consequence. By morning, the weight of inevitability pressed in. Messages began arriving, not accusatory or emotional, but measured and procedural, signaling that the situation had already moved beyond personal negotiation. Claire had not acted impulsively. She had chosen documentation over confrontation, certainty over chaos. Melissa understood then that the aftermath would not be loud or dramatic. It would be methodical. The life she had assumed would unravel slowly now began doing so with quiet efficiency. She noticed how quickly certainty dissolved once trust was removed from the equation. The days that followed forced Melissa into a clarity she had avoided for months. She could no longer frame her affair as a contained deviation or an emotional response to neglect. It had become the central axis around which everything else turned. The home no longer felt like refuge, but like evidence. Each night spent there reminded her that boundaries, once crossed, cannot be re-established simply through regret. She anticipated her husband's return, not with fear, but with resignation, understanding that the version of their marriage she once relied on had ceased to exist the moment secrecy entered it. When Aaron finally returned from his trip, the distance between them was immediate and unmistakable. There were no raised voices or dramatic gestures, only a recognition that the foundation had been compromised beyond restoration. Melissa sensed that the truth had already reached him, carried not through accusation, but through undeniable circumstance. The calmness of his demeanor unsettled her more than anger ever could have. It reflected a man who had moved past questioning and into decision. Melissa realized then that her attempt to manage outcomes through secrecy had instead accelerated their arrival. The consequences she once believed could be delayed had arrived fully formed, demanding response rather than explanation. As days passed, the practical dismantling of their shared life began. Schedules shifted, Spaces divided, routines dissolved. Melissa watched it all with a growing awareness that nothing she said now could return them to where they were. The affair, once framed in her mind as an escape, revealed itself as an ending. She understood that the real loss was not just the marriage, but the identity she had built within it, now stripped away and replaced by uncertainty. The reckoning she feared was no longer looming. It was unfolding steadily, shaping a future she could not yet define. Melissa felt the first true weight of her choices settle in, not as punishment imposed from outside, but as a reality she would have to navigate alone. In the weeks that followed Aaron's return, Melissa's life reorganized itself around absences rather than presence. The house, once defined by shared routines and quiet familiarity, became a space divided by intention rather than comfort. She watched the dismantling of her marriage unfold through practical steps and instead of emotional confrontation, realizing that the quietness of it all was far more unsettling than any argument could have been. Trust, once removed, did not announce its departure. It simply ceased to function, leaving everything else to collapse under its absence. Melissa felt this most acutely in the way Aaron moved through the house with purpose, but without connection, as though the emotional architecture they built together had already been abandoned in his mind. There was no effort to repair, no attempt to understand her perspective, only a steady progression towards separation that made her recognize how final the exposure had been. Claire's decision to involve herself had not merely revealed the affair. It had accelerated its consequences beyond anything Melissa believed she could manage. The narrative was no longer hers to shape. Friends became distant, not out of cruelty, but out of discomfort, unsure how to position themselves around a situation that no longer had ambiguity. Melissa understood then that infidelity does not fracture relationships evenly. It isolates the one who crossed the boundary, leaving them to confront the aftermath alone. The sense of invisibility that once drove her toward the affair returned, but now it carried a different weight. It was not neglect that surrounded her, but accountability. As legal and logistical realities took shape, Melissa confronted the permanence of her choices. The marriage ended without spectacle, marked by signatures rather than tears, and the quiet finality of it forced her to confront an identity stripped of justification. She could no longer frame herself as misunderstood or emotionally deprived. What remained was a woman who had prioritized secrecy over honesty and control over consequence. The affair that once felt like an assertion of autonomy now appeared as a miscalculation rooted in avoidance. Melissa spent long hours alone, reflecting not on what she lost, but on what she misunderstood about herself. She realized that the attention she sought elsewhere had not been about love or fulfillment, but about reassurance she was unwilling to ask for openly. In seeking validation through deception, she had traded short-term affirmation for long-term fracture. Over time, the intensity of regret softened into something more constructive, awareness. Melissa accepted that the life she once had would not be restored, and that longing for forgiveness would only prolong her stagnation. Instead, she began rebuilding with intention rather than desperation. She downsized, reorganized her routines, and re-entered the world without the illusion that she could outrun consequence. The process was slow and often uncomfortable, but it was grounded in reality rather than fantasy. She learned that moving forward did not require absolution from those she hurt, only honesty with herself. Occasionally, she thought of Claire, not with resentment, but with recognition. Claire's intervention had forced a reckoning Melissa would have otherwise delayed indefinitely. The exposure, though painful, had removed the illusion that secrecy could coexist with stability. Melissa understood that the night she invited Daniel into her home was not the beginning of her downfall, but the moment her choices intersected irreversibly with truth. As time passed, the urgency of that night faded into memory, but its lessons remained vivid. Melissa did not rewrite the story to cast herself as a victim. She carried it as a reminder of how easily rationalization can become betrayal when unchecked. Her future unfolded quietly, without grand declarations or dramatic redemption, shaped instead by consistency and restraint. The life she built afterward was smaller, simpler, and far more honest than the one she destroyed. And though the consequences of her affair would always remain part of her story, they no longer defined her entirely. What defined her now was the willingness to live without illusion, to accept that some losses cannot be undone, and to move forward without pretending they never happened.